What would you do if you walked into a courthouse and minutes later were dragged into a back room and had your head shaved just because you're a black woman? Would you cry, scream, or would you walk back out and sit in the highest seat in the room, the judge's bench? This isn't a movie. This happened right here at the Briarvale Courthouse. And that woman, Evelyn Monroe, didn't just break the silence, she rewrote the system. Don't blink, because what happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice, power, and truth. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, subscribe so you never miss a single one. Now, let's begin. No sirens, no warm welcome. No one held the door. Evelyn Monroe walked into the Briarvale County Courthouse like any other citizen. The worn heels of her black shoes tapped steadily against the cold marble floor. Each step quiet, unnoticed. No robe, no shining badge. She didn't need either, because that day she wasn't here to be seen. She came to see and to find out if this system still recognized itself. At the end of the hallway, a little girl with tight curls clutched her mother's hand. She glanced back and whispered, "Who is that lady?" The mother lowered her eyes and said nothing. Maybe because she didn't know, or maybe because she was afraid to believe what her instincts already told her. 3 minutes later, Evelyn stood at the metal detector. Silas Whitmore, a longtime deputy officer, crossed his arms. His gaze scanned a woman standing just a little too upright to be ordinary. "Step out of line," he said, his voice cold. She replied softly, "Is there a problem, officer?" No one answered, but every other eye in the room said enough. She should know her place. She was pulled aside without warning. Stone mirror control room, a space as cold as the kind of men who abuse power. A metal chair, a pair of scissors, 3 men circling. Evelyn knew she couldn't fight them with her hands, so she gave up something she never thought she'd be forced to lose: her silver hair. Neatly pinned every morning, a family tradition, a symbol passed down from women who had once been silenced too. No one asked her name. No one asked why she came. And that was the real tragedy. Until she rose, pain throbbing under her raw scalp, walked out of that room, and headed straight for the judge's bench. She left the stone mirror control room without her proud silver hair, but with her head held higher than anyone else in that hallway. No words. No glance asking for pity. Evelyn Monroe walked straight toward the Avalon hearing room as if humiliation had never touched her. She passed those who had smirked as she was dragged away. Now they couldn't meet their own reflections. And then she sat in the judge's chair, back straight, eyes sharp as steel. The room froze. The same people who once believed they held power now sat beneath the gaze of the very woman they tried to erase. "The hearing is now in session," she said. Just one sentence, but it felt like the ground itself trembled. 2 minutes later, Evelyn lifted her chin and spoke each word with clarity. "Deputy Officer Silas Whitmore, step forward." The courtroom turned to stone. Silas didn't move. He blinked, instinctively stepped back, as if staring into the eyes of history's reckoning. "Do you know who I am?" Evelyn asked, not loud but thunderous. I don't," he whispered. "You don't need to," she replied, "because what you did this morning speaks louder than 14 years of silence." Tessa Marlowe, a young intern sitting in the back, pale, shaken, slowly stood. I saw it too," she said, voice trembling. Then someone else stood, and another. Caleb Thatcher, a gray-haired man with a scar along his ribs from an incident back in 2011, gently placed his hand on the bench in front of him and said, "They beat me. Right here. They said I fell." This was no longer a courtroom. It had become a place where pain finally spoke, out loud, for the first time. And behind the bench, Evelyn didn't blink. She had always known this moment would come. She just never imagined it would strike hard enough to silence the entire system. She didn't rise to confront the system. She sat to make it tremble. When Evelyn Monroe draped the black robe over her shoulders and stepped through the doors of the Avalon hearing room, No one inside was ready for what they were about to witness. The woman they had humiliated was now sitting in the highest seat in the room. She didn't look around. She didn't need to. Just one sentence echoed like a command from the earth itself, rising straight into the ceiling. This hearing is now in session. The air shifted instantly, as if a storm had passed through, and everyone stood frozen in the eye of something even bigger coming. Then came the moment it all cracked open. "Deputy Silas Whitmore, you are summoned." Evelyn's voice cut like glass. It wasn't loud, but no one could mistake what was happening. Silas moved slowly, face pale. His hands twitched near his sides, as if still searching for a lie to hide behind. She didn't give him the chance. "You didn't touch me with authority. You touched me with contempt, and not just me." "How many times have you done that before?" Silence. Then from the back, Tessa Marlowe stood. Again. I saw it," she said. "Not just today. 2 weeks ago. He dragged someone else in there." A sharp inhale pierced the room. Grayson Holt, the father of a protester who'd suffered a crushed windpipe, rose to his feet, his hands clenched, trembling. "They said my son tripped, but I heard him scream from that room." Evelyn didn't flinch. She gave a slight nod. "That's enough. An arrest warrant for Deputy Silas Whitmore is now in effect." 2 officers stepped forward. The cuffs clicked shut around the wrists of the man who once seemed untouchable. There was no applause. But for the first time in years, the truth made a sound. Outside, the crowd was growing. But inside the Avalon hearing room, all it took was one timely testimony to shift the course of history. "We will proceed," Evelyn said calmly after Silas was escorted out. The air still carried the sting of tension as the prosecutor rose. "Today's incident is only the surface," he said. "We request to summon witnesses from last year's Briarvale protest, an operation led by Lieutenant Rowan Kingsley." A video appeared on the large screen. A peaceful crowd, signs reading "Justice for All," and then an elderly man shoved to the stone sidewalk, blood soaking through his white shirt. The room stopped breathing. That man, now seated at the witness stand, was named Howard Briggs. He adjusted his knit cap, then spoke, his voice rough, worn. "I begged them, told them to stop pushing. I served in the Marines once. But my son, he was just standing there, still holding a milk carton. And then, someone in uniform, face covered, pressed a knee into his neck." Evelyn clenched her fists, not out of shock, but because that same helplessness had returned. "When I screamed, they shoved me. I fell, heard my own bones snap. But what hurt most was waking up the next morning to headlines that read, 'Protest remains peaceful.' The silence that followed was the kind that thickens the air. The kind only born when every lie has finally collapsed." Rowan Kingsley sat stiffly below, his back like stone. Evelyn stared straight at him. No cross-examination needed. "Lieutenant Kingsley, you wrote that no serious injuries occurred." 1 hour after Silas Whitmore was let out in handcuffs, Evelyn still wasn't finished. She hadn't come to take down a man. She came to unmask a system. "I request to enter into the official record 12 formal complaints filed against Deputy Silas Whitmore over the past 14 years, she said. "All of them were dismissed." She lifted her head, eyes drilling into the row of prosecutors and judicial board members. The air turned colder than the AC, and then Evelyn began to read the names. "Filed by Denise Hall, dragged from the courtroom for wearing jeans. No action taken. Filed by Marcus Delroy, punched in the face for asking directions. No action taken." No one moved. They had heard the rumors, but never like this. Never one by one, case by case, with every silenced voice read aloud, like a reckoning handed directly to the system's front door. "Why was no action taken?" Evelyn asked, then answered herself. "Because every single dismissal was signed by the same person, Judge Rhodes, the former legal advisor to my office." The room shook, not just from the name, but from how she said it. No tremble, no hesitation. It was a blade pulled from her own chest and placed on the table. From the back row, a records clerk stood up. Aurora Sinclair, hair pinned back, eyes tired but unflinching. I, I typed those reports, she said. I was instructed to mark them resolved, even though I knew they were never investigated. She held up copies. Pages once printed, once shredded, once buried in silence. Evelyn took them without needing to look. This system isn't broken. It was built this way. And today, we stopped pretending. A truth buried for 14 years now rang through the courtroom. Quiet, clear, undeniable. As the cold steel of the handcuffs locked around Silas Whitmore's wrists, the courtroom held its breath. No one moved, not a whisper, only eyes, tracking the man who had once instilled fear in witnesses, now being led down the very hallway he used to dominate. Outside, phones began to buzz in unison. The first message lit up. Deputy Silas Whitmore arrested, inside the courtroom. 2 minutes later, Whitlock Square erupted. People poured in, as if something sacred had finally been awakened. Banners once still now waved beneath the sun. Not arrested because we screamed, but because someone finally listened. Evelyn stepped outside, not for rest, but to see herself reflected in the eyes of the people now gathered at the courthouse steps. An elderly black woman placed her hand over her heart when she saw her. A college student raised a notebook, the first page scrawled with trembling ink. I was dragged into that room too, but I wasn't a judge. Evelyn didn't cry, but the young clerk behind her did. Inside, news outlets scrambled to go live. CNN, MSNB, Vox, all running the same breaking headline. Judicial earthquake, a judge shamed, now reverses power from the bench. A slow aerial shot captured Silas being led to the squad car, head bowed. And across the plaza, beneath the statue of Lady Justice, the crowd raised theirs. A reversal, a reckoning. Evelyn turned and walked back inside, slowly. All rise, the clerk announced, not out of protocol, but instinct, because now everyone knew. That woman had just made justice stand up, in every sense of the word. In the echoing silence that followed the historic arrest, a quiet voice rose from the back row of court staff seats. I need to say something. All eyes turned. There stood Tessa Marlowe, a first-year intern at the Briarvale courthouse. She was trembling, but she didn't back down. She had never been called by name, never spoken up. But today she stepped out from the shadow of the fear she had long chosen as her shelter. I saw it happen that morning. I was standing less than 5 meters away when Deputy Silas pulled Judge Monroe into the screening room. I heard the clippers. I saw her hair falling to the floor. She drew a shaky breath. A single tear slipped down her cheek. I didn't do anything. I just stood there, and I stayed silent. Evelyn didn't speak. She didn't nod. She didn't offer comfort. She simply listened. Let the girl speak the weight she'd been carrying like a stone in her chest for weeks. If you need me to testify, I will, Tessa said, voice steadying. No anonymity. I've been quiet long enough. Behind her, someone else stood, then another, each holding a story, a memory, a scar no one had ever asked about. But Tessa had been the first. Evelyn looked straight at her, not with the gaze of a judge, but with the eyes of someone who knew too well what it felt like to be the only one. No one believed. Thank you, Tessa, she said, her voice cracking slightly but firm. You just did what people with far more power couldn't do. For 14 years. In that moment, the courtroom stopped being a place of procedure and became, for the first time, a place where every voice was finally allowed to matter. After Tessa's voice broke the silence, a stillness swept through the courtroom, sharp like a blade. But then, a middle-aged man rose to his feet. His face was worn, tight around an old scar that had long healed, but never faded. My name is Caleb Thatcher, he said, voice dry like smoke, and I am Emma's father. He stepped into the center of the room, his throat burning with every word. In 2012, my daughter was charged with theft for not paying the full price of a loaf of bread. I shouted in that courtroom when I saw her being handcuffed. They didn't let me speak. Instead, they beat me. Once. Twice. I woke up in the hospital with 2 broken ribs. No report, nothing. He paused, reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a worn, folded piece of paper, a letter that had never been mailed. I wrote this to the court back then, but I never had the courage to submit it. Evelyn didn't interrupt. She didn't rush to take it. She let him speak, as if no one had ever granted him the right to breathe deeply before. Then from the back rows a woman stood, then a young man holding a photo of his father, wrongfully arrested years ago. The entire room shifted. Among hundreds seated there suddenly, no one was invisible anymore. Each story, each voice cut into the silence like a blade, carving through years of being unheard. Behind the bench, Evelyn clasped her hands. She didn't hide her tears. "None of you," she said, her voice soft but certain, "ever needed permission to be believed." And in that moment, for the first time, the system sat and listened to the people it had long abandoned. No rebuttals, no interruptions, just silence and listening. Still inside the packed courtroom, where the air had thickened with truths long denied the right to be spoken, a hand slowly rose. "My name is Grayson Holt, and my son's name was Elijah." An older man, thinned by the weight of time, stepped into the center holding a faded photograph. It showed a boy in a plain white t-shirt, a mischievous but gentle glint in his eyes, his smile forever frozen at 16. Elijah wasn't protesting, he said, his voice catching. He stood outside the barrier, holding a cardboard sign that read, "I want to live." The words broke, then collapsed into silence. What he got in return was a knee, pressed against his neck, for 7 minutes. The entire room froze. No cough, no scribble of a pen, just his stillness, raw and undisturbed. Grayson held the photo out toward Evelyn, his hands trembling. "They called it a tactical error. I call it murder." Evelyn didn't look away, her hand pressed over her heart, not as a judge, but as someone who knew the shape of grief that defies language. Then Grayson turned to face the back of the courtroom. "I didn't come here for justice," he said. "I came to reclaim my son's name." At that moment, Aurora Sinclair broke down. She wasn't Elijah's family, but in that instant, they all were. Family to something that had been suffocated, quietly for too long. Evelyn bowed her head, then raised it again, eyes steady as she faced the room. "To me," she said, "Elijah did not die nameless. He became the witness who now forces us to live with honor." Right after Grayson Holt's heart-wrenching testimony, the courtroom air nearly froze solid. But then, from the very back row, where observers usually sat, a figure slowly stood. It was Jasper Langdon, a retired officer who once served under Silas Whitmore. His uniform was faded, and he clutched his cap tightly in both hands as if trying to wring the guilt from his own bones. "I didn't come here to defend anyone," he began, voice rough and weathered. "But I was part of the silence that's killed too many right things." He stepped forward, one slow step at a time. He didn't look at Evelyn. He didn't look at the crowd. He kept his eyes fixed on the boots he'd worn since his discharge, like they carried the weight of every step he should have taken, but didn't. "I saw Silas use a neck hold on a 12-year-old boy because the kid spray-painted the fence outside Judge Rhodes's house. I filed a report, but when that file disappeared, I stayed quiet." A breath escaped him, less an exhale than a collapse. "I told myself I wasn't strong enough to fight the whole system. Now I realize it's exactly because we all think that way that the system survives." Sniffling echoed from the gallery. Evelyn blinked but didn't cry. She gave a small nod, not of forgiveness, but acknowledgement. "Mr. Langdon," she said, her voice steady as stone, "what you brought today won't erase the past, but it may just save a future that hasn't been written wrong yet." Then, from behind him, a woman stood. She raised a worn file high in the air. "I'm the mother of that boy," she said, "and I'm ready to testify." The room stirred, not with noise, but with the swell of something deeper. The first ripple of courage, not from the innocent, but from someone who once chose silence and chose, at last, to speak. As Jasper Langdon's confession still echoed through the room, another voice rose, soft but unwavering. "My name is Aurora Sinclair, and I've been silent for far too long." Every head turned. There stood a woman in a wrinkled blouse, her hair pulled back in haste, face bare of makeup, but eyes lit like a lantern in the dead of night. She was once the records clerk at the South District Justice Office, and for 6 years she had handled internal complaints. Aurora stepped forward, holding a slim stack of papers tucked into a weathered, sealed envelope. "These," she said, "are copies of 12 complaints submitted to the Office of Public Oversight." Then she looked up, straight at the row of defense attorneys. "I was ordered to delete them by Maxwell Rhodes, then senior legal advisor to Judge Monroe." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Maxwell, who had sat silently since the hearing began, jolted. Evelyn didn't turn, but her shoulders visibly tensed. Aurora inhaled deeply. "I once tried to leak this to a local journalist. That same night, my front door was spray-painted with the word traitor in red. My daughter was 8. She screamed all night." She paused, not for effect, but to breathe. "I'm not a hero," she said. "I'm just a mother who refuses to let her child grow up in a system where truth is something you bury." A woman in the gallery broke into tears. Another stood, lifting her hand high. "My complaint was buried too." The courtroom began to stir, voices rising, energy swelling. And in that moment, Evelyn gently placed her hand on the bench. "We're no longer holding a trial for a man," she said quietly. "We're putting silence itself on trial." The air inside the courtroom felt thick enough to drown in, as if there was no room left for any more truth. But Evelyn Monroe stood. Calmly, she reached into her leather case and pulled out a dark brown folder, its surface worn, the old embossed seal still visible. "Classified records, Maple Cliff." The entire room fell silent. Evelyn walked slowly toward the witness stand and placed the folder down, like lowering a 1,000-pound stone onto the table. "This," she said, "is a handwritten transcript of a closed-door meeting held in 2011 at Maple Cliff Library between 3 former state justice officials and District Chief Riker." She opened to the first page, voice steady but her eyes blazing. The very first line in the minutes reads, "Silence ensures stability for the entire system." A wave of outrage tore through the courtroom. Evelyn continued, reading aloud the details of cases quietly buried, promotions traded for silence, and a secret fund used to cover off-record damages. The list included names of people who once stood on podiums, declaring they served justice, now seated in the highest chairs of power. Someone shouted, "My name's in there!" I filed one of those. A woman sobbed from the aisle. "My husband died after he blew the whistle, and I thought he was wrong." Evelyn closed the folder with slow finality. Then she spoke. "I know, one transcript won't rewrite history, but if it can reshape what comes next, then let today be where it begins." No one remained seated. Across the courtroom, people stood, pulling out old letters, photocopied reports, printed photos, a flood of buried truth erupting through the dam of silence. And at that exact moment, Evelyn's gavel struck the bench. "This court now enters special hearing status," she declared. "The entire system will answer." After the testimonies that shook the very core of the system, Evelyn Monroe stepped down from the bench and walked to the center floor. In her hands was a manuscript sealed in red, the title handwritten in bold black ink, "The Monroe Order, Emergency Reform of the State and Federal Judicial System." The room held its breath. Evelyn looked out, at those who had once stayed silent and those who had just found their voices. "We cannot erase what happened," she said, "but we can redraw the lines so it never happens again." She announced the formation of an independent judicial oversight committee, elected by the people, not the system. She called for the reopening of all 217 previously dismissed complaints to be reviewed and retried within 90 days. She introduced mandatory ethical evaluations for every judge, prosecutor, and courthouse officer, including herself. And then she dropped the boldest proposal of all. All current personnel, she declared, must undergo re-education, a minimum of 20 required hours on unconscious bias, abuse of authority, and the foundations of human dignity. A senior prosecutor stood visibly shaken. "You realize," he said, "this will drive half the judiciary to resign?" Evelyn nodded, but her voice had never been steadier. I hope it's more than half, she replied, because if they're afraid of relearning how to be human, they never deserved to guard the law in the first place. In the front row, a young mother squeezed her son's hand, tears in her eyes, but something like hope behind them. From the back, the first round of applause rose. Not thunderous, but enough to spark something in that room once built to muffle truth. And like a single heartbeat becoming a rhythm, people began to rise, not out of obligation, but because they knew, for the first time, the law wasn't just continuing, it was beginning again. From the third row, Reverend Quentin Hart slowly rose, his hand clutching a weathered folder, its spine worn thin, its cover held together with faded brown tape. He walked carefully to the center of the room, eyes flickering between resolve and a sorrow long carried. I buried this 9 years ago, he said, voice trembling but firm. Not because I didn't know what to do with it, but because I didn't believe anyone would listen. He placed the folder on the bench. Scrawled across the cover in fading ink were the words, "Those who were never heard." Inside were 46 names, each one accompanied by a wound, a dismissed report, a pain that had never received a reply. And today, they showed up. An elderly woman stood. I'm the mother of Tyrone, the boy who got beaten for riding his bike in a wealthy neighborhood. A young man shaking stepped forward. From his pocket, he pulled a crumpled slip of paper. My evidence. I filed a complaint. They told me I made it up. The room fell into a hush that no gavel could break. No voice of law, no legal language, only truth, handed forward by those who had been forced to carry it alone for far too long. Evelyn stepped down from the bench. She didn't bring power with her, only two open hands. Today, she said softly, power doesn't come from titles. It comes from the courage to face each other as we truly are. A young brown-skinned boy, no older than 10, tugged gently at Quentin's coat. Mister, he whispered, can I speak now? Quentin knelt, pulled the boy close, his vision blurred with tears. Yes, child, he said. Now the whole country is listening to you. Under the pale morning sun, the gates of Briarvale Courthouse no longer looked like an ordinary entrance. They had become the gathering point of a nation beginning to wake up. Justice flags fluttered in the breeze. Signs reading, "We see you, we stand with her," stretched across the crowd like a living wall of resolve. News vans lined the avenue, bumpers nearly touching. Camera lenses aimed directly at the courthouse steps, waiting. A long line of civil rights attorneys, some from as far as Oregon and Georgia, arrived one by one. Dark coats, sunglasses, files clutched to their chests. They hadn't come to watch. They came to stand beside the truth. For the first time in years, whispered one Asian American attorney to her colleague as they approached the doors, we're not here to defend. We're here to testify. Behind the security barrier, families once silenced by fear now had a reason to wear matching shirts with portraits of the loved ones they'd lost. A child held up a sign with both hands. My dad was silenced, but I won't be. Inside the courtroom, Evelyn sat still, her gaze fixed on the wave of humanity pouring in like a tide made of courage. The air was thick with tension, but in the midst of it all, a moment broke through. A young woman, who had once wept quietly when her case was dismissed, stepped forward. She stood tall. For the first time in 4 years, she spoke. My name is Nina Daniels, she said, voice steady, and I am no longer a victim. Today, I am a witness. The courtroom rose to its feet, not out of shock, but because, for the first time in their lives, truth had taken on a shape they could finally see. Under mounting pressure from media spin and conservative lobbyists, an official request was delivered to Evelyn Monroe's chambers. Due to the sensitive nature of this case and personal connections involved, you are encouraged to recuse yourself from presiding. Polished words, but the message was cold and clear. They wanted her silent. In a moment so still, it seemed no one dared to breathe, Evelyn stood in the center of the packed courtroom, holding the letter in her hand. She didn't shout. She didn't argue in fury. She simply tore it in half, right there, in front of the entire court. Her eyes swept across the gallery, where the wounded were learning how to hope again. Then she spoke, each word etched into the air like steel. I will not step down, not because I am the strongest person in this room, but because I am the only one still standing after everyone else has been knocked down. A chair scraped softly. Grayson Holt rose, leaning on his cane, eyes damp. Another sound. Tessa Marlowe stood next. Then Caleb. Then others. One by one, the forgotten rose. Outside, loudspeakers carried Evelyn's voice through the courthouse plaza. And against Briarvale's gray sky, a small yellow kite lifted gently above the sea of people. No one spoke of it. No one needed to. It was understood. Faith had found its way back home. And Evelyn, calm but unshakable, delivered her final words. Justice does not belong to silence. Justice belongs to action. And today, action begins here. After sentencing Silas Whitmore before millions of watching eyes, Evelyn Monroe didn't rush to leave the bench. The lights inside Halden National Hall still burned bright. But the audience sat in silence. Not the silence of fear, but of reverence and anticipation. She slowly raised a hand to her head and removed the wig she'd worn since the day of her public humiliation. Beneath it, a jagged line of remaining hair, untouched, a wound left unfinished. She looked down at the front row, at a black girl curled into her mother's arms, at faces once voiceless, now trembling with emotion, at the generations of black women who had never been granted the dignity of choosing how to exist in the world. Then, from her robe, she drew a pair of clippers. She didn't speak. Each buzz echoed through the chamber, not to erase shame, but to carve her name on her own terms into this moment, not as a victim, but as a woman reborn, as a leader refusing to let an incomplete pain fester into a quiet scar. Reverend Quentin Hart bowed his head in prayer. A journalist wiped away tears, and the sign language interpreter, hands trembling, relayed Evelyn's final words to the deaf members of the audience. Rebirth doesn't begin when you forgive others. It begins when you look in the mirror and dare to forgive yourself for being silent too long. The applause didn't start in one place. It erupted, organically, collectively, as if a shared heartbeat had returned after a historic pause, and reminded everyone they were still alive. At Clarendon West Academy, where Evelyn Monroe once walked the halls as a teenage student, the atmosphere inside the Grand Library fell into a quiet hush as she entered. There was no judge's robe, no flashing cameras, just her, a woman with a shaved head and eyes that had stared into the darkest corners of justice. Students and teachers filled the room, waiting. Then from the third row, an eighth grader named Clara Winslow raised her hand. Her voice was soft but steady. Do you still believe in the system after what it did to you? The room held its breath. Evelyn lowered her head. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she walked over to the whiteboard where someone had written in neat cursive, "The power of belief." She placed her hand over her heart. No, Clara, she said. I don't believe in that old system anymore, but I believe in the people growing up inside it. I believe in you because you had the courage to ask that question. A quiet moment passed. Then, another hand rose, and another, and another. This wasn't just a Q&A. It was the beginning of something. Evelyn didn't need to shout to spark change. Change had already started. The moment a child dared to ask, and an adult answered with her whole truth. Clara smiled, her eyes glistening. Evelyn turned to leave the library, and in the rearview mirror of memory, she knew. Systems don't change through declarations. They change through belief, one child at a time. Inside the small hall at Clarendon West Academy, the very place where Evelyn Monroe once learned to believe in justice through thick, weighty books, she now stood before the next generation. There was no spotlight, no lingering echo of her courtroom triumph. Just Evelyn, quietly stepping up to the wooden podium, facing rows of wide, uncertain, hopeful eyes. Clara Winslow, an eighth grader, stood up. Her voice trembled, but her words landed like stone. If this system once hurt you, why are you still standing here? Evelyn smiled, a smile that didn't try to hide its scars. She didn't answer from the stage. She stepped down, and sat eye to eye with Clara. "Because you're still asking," she said softly, her voice deliberate, steady. "I don't believe in the old system, the one that stayed silent, that stood complicit, that let me be humiliated in the very room I once called justice. But I believe in what it could become if we dare to face it, like you just did." The room held its breath. Then someone at the back clapped. Then another and another. Not for a perfect answer, but for the courage of a conversation that was never supposed to happen. Evelyn looked at Clara one last time before rising to leave. In the girl's eyes wasn't just belief, but something greater, the choice to change. And in that moment, without a decree, without a gavel, without a courtroom, Evelyn knew the system had just begun to heal with a single question. At Halden National Hall, where the most revered names in the history of justice had once stood, Evelyn Monroe stepped onto the stage to a standing ovation that seemed to have no end. Pinned to her chest was the Medal of Justice, presented personally by President Declan Avery. But it wasn't the spotlight, the cameras, or the applause that brought tears to her eyes. Because Evelyn knew the greatest honor of her life wasn't the medal. It was knowing that the voices once crushed into silence had finally been heard. In the audience, those same people once denied their truths began to rise. Some with hunched backs, some with trembling hands, some lifting their heads for the first time in decades. She saw them all: Tessa, Caleb, Grayson, Jasper, Aurora, and she nodded. Not as a judge, but as a witness to real change. Then Evelyn stepped down from the stage, leaving the glory behind. And when a reporter asked, "Do you have any message for the next generation?" she smiled. "I'm not here to be celebrated," she said. "I'm here because I survived, and I'll keep surviving, to clear the path for those still trapped in silence." If you've stayed with us through the end of this story, share your thoughts. Do you believe a system can change? Leave a comment below. And if you believe in truth, in courage, in stories like this, don't hesitate to subscribe, because together we're writing the next chapter of justice. Some stories don't need preaching. They just need one person to stand up at the right moment, and suddenly we realize justice doesn't live in law books. It lives in a heart brave enough not to look away. Evelyn Monroe's story wasn't just a headline-making trial. It was proof that silence in the face of injustice is a choice. When she was dragged into a control room, humiliated, her head shaved, she didn't fight with rage. She walked out, lifted her chin, and sat in the judge's chair, forcing an entire system to confront the darkness it had long buried. She didn't seek personal victory. She opened a door for those like Caleb, Grayson, and Aurora to finally speak. She didn't choose vengeance. She chose to reveal. No one handed Evelyn power. It was the silence of others that made her voice impossible to ignore. The greatest lesson here: one person can change everything, not because they are stronger, but because they step forward, while everyone else is still hesitating. And sometimes the bravest act is simply to sit down, open court, and say, "We will begin again, this time with the truth." So if you've ever wondered whether you can make a difference, remember Evelyn Monroe and start